because it suggests that the escitalopram does not adversely affect cognition, which has been found by some previous studies looking at the acute administration. And even though participants in our study showed this reduced reinforcement sensitivity, they were not worse at learning overall. And as I mentioned, this is encouraging as participants often taking these drugs chronically. It suggests that it's not affecting their overall learning. So there are a number of points to note when interpreting the results from our own study, but also when considering any study that has examined the effects of serotonin on cognition. So first, it's important to acknowledge the differences between acute and chronic SSRI administration. So previous literature has suggested that the neuroadaptive changes might represent homeostatic mechanisms by which the brain regulates neurotransmission in response to the drug. And this may actually suggest that the acute effects are not as robust as the longer term effects where this mechanism would have stabilized. In addition, acute administration of SSRIs does not seem to affect neuroplasticity, which does occur when SSRIs are administered chronically. So in addition, the synaptic mechanism of action for acute and chronic SSRI administration differs. So a meta-analysis showed that within the first week of SSRI administration, 5-HT concentrations actually drop, and then this increases over the following 2 weeks of administration. And this also varies depending on the brain region in which you're measuring serotonin levels. So we chose the duration of 3 weeks because this is a duration that's not only associated with clinical benefits in patients with MDD, but also with the translational studies of neuroplastic effects. But we also can't rule out that the neuroplastic effects might be greater with longer duration of escitalopram. And a second important consideration is that the approaches for the induction of changes in serotonin vary, and this could also result in inconsistent findings. So for example, previous studies that have manipulated serotonin acutely with different methods, but using the same PRL task, actually showed inconsistent results depending on whether it was tryptophan depletion or whether it was SSRI administration. But importantly, again, this was with conventional behavioral measures and not with the hierarchical Bayesian modeling we used. It should also be noted that there's currently no reliable way to determine serotonin concentrations in the brain non-invasively in humans. And this means that the interpretation of the manipulations are only inferential. And finally, with regards to our own study, it is likely that the escitalopram effects are less discernible in our cognitively high-performing healthy volunteers than it would be in patients with MDD. So studies on depression have found that SSRI intervention often normalizes abnormal neural processing, which in turn improves cognitive function and at a later point, mood. As healthy individuals are cognitively intact, it's possible that the effects may be different from those in patients with MDD. And the differential effects on cognition and mood can be seen when studies are conducted either with healthy volunteers or patients with MDD. And as such, the mechanisms of SSRIs may be more restorative in depression, which is unnecessary in healthy individuals. But overall, given that SSRIs are chronically administered to patients with these neuropsychiatric disorders, the results from the present study are slightly more clinically relevant than those of acute studies. So in conclusion, in contrast with previous reports on the acute effects of SSRI administration, we did not find any significant effects on cold cognitive measures after more chronic administration of escitalopram. Our key novel finding was that escitalopram had a specific effect on reinforcement sensitivity on 2 different tests of reinforcement learning. And this suggests a key role for serotonin in reinforcement learning. The lower reinforcement sensitivity noted in the escitalopram group may be similar to the blunting effect reported by patients during SSRI treatment, but it's important to understand that this may also be a symptom of depression, which makes it difficult to fully comprehend exactly what is happening in people with depression. Our study does suggest that at least some of this may be due to the drug and that further work is required to understand the exact mechanism by which SSRIs achieve their therapeutic process. And patients with depression are often hypersensitive to negative feedback and they have negative attentional biases. So this means, for example, when a healthy person is walking down the street they might see all the people smiling, but an individual with depression may focus on the single person that looks sad and upset. So therefore, dampening down the negative emotions and distress felt by depressed patients may be part of the therapeutic process for these drugs. However, because they can't selectively target negative emotions, they unfortunately seem to also take away some of the enjoyment. Again, this doesn't mean that they're not effective, and also not everyone who takes them experiences this blunting effect, but it does provide more understanding as to how these drugs may work, and that might help to provide better treatment options in future. And for many people suffering from depression, SSRIs improve their condition significantly. It gives them a better quality of life and improves their ability to function in everyday life. And in fact, a recent meta-analysis examined 21 different antidepressants and showed that they were all more effective than placebo. So the findings from our study show that more work is required to fully understand the way in which these drugs work, but it does not suggest that they're not still useful and necessary for a number of people suffering from depression. So in terms of future directions, there's two clear ones that I want to suggest for this work. So the first, of course, is to understand how chronic SSRIs affect cognition in patients with major depressive disorder. Our study only used healthy controls, and they don't have the same cognitive impairments that I've mentioned that are noted in patients with depression. For example, the negative affective biases and the abnormal response to negative feedback. And this may mean that the way in which SSRI work in patients may differ from what we've seen in healthy volunteers. And in addition, it's important to gain a better understanding of the neural mechanisms that may underlie the effects of escitalopram on reinforcement learning. And indeed, actually, as part of this study, participants did undergo magnetic resonance imaging during performance on a reward learning task, and we are currently in the process of analyzing this data. So finally, I'd like to thank the participants that took part in the study, as well as my collaborators and the funders of the study, which is the Lundbeck Foundation. And I thank you very much for your attention, and I welcome any questions.
Okay, who wants to start? Anyone want to have a question? I'm sure there will be.
I'll ask first.
Yeah.
While everyone is thinking about the questions. Wonderful talk. Thank you. I wonder if you think that this is going to be a kind of the class effect for SSRI, or it might be different in terms of like different drugs. What do you think about that?
I think it may be a class effect for SSRIs, but not for all antidepressants. Of course, we know some antidepressants work on different mechanisms. SNRIs, for example, also work on noradrenaline. So I would think that because of the serotonergic mechanisms within all SSRIs, that they would work on a similar mechanism, but it definitely wouldn't transfer to others. That being said, of course, we did only look at escitalopram, so that might not be true.
That might be kind of cool to compare between different medication and see how it
definitely. No, I think that's another thing to consider exactly is whether different, even just different antidepressants have similar effects. I mean, there has been some literature, obviously not by our own groups, but that have shown that this blunting effect is more commonly reported in the SSRIs than they are in SNRIs, for example. So this is kind of what I meant with what would be good for providing future treatment options. If we think that someone might be susceptible to the emotional blunting, it might be better to put them on a different kind of drug.
Right. And also, I think it's pretty amazing that you used this modeling approach and starting to see this effect. And when you look at your previous result from the same group, and you find that you find that if you use the same computational modeling, then you start to see the effect in the acute phase. So my question is, how much do you think that the fact that you see the effect is because that you pick the right kind of analysis technique compared to like all the other null result effect let's say you can, use more sophisticated modeling technique, might you be able to recover some of the cold cognitive effect or other hot cognitive effect?
I think it's important to say that obviously it's specifically that those reinforcement learning models are specific to reward learning, for example. You wouldn't necessarily apply similar models to inhibition tasks, for example.
Of course.
They're shown to be quite sensitive in and of themselves. And we think, at least, that some of the reasons that we notice this mechanism in acute administration is like I said, about almost the homeostatic response. So it's almost as if there's a greater neural response to an acute drug, because you're sort of suddenly trying to actually regain balance. Whereas obviously over a chronic administration, that stability already starts to take place. But certainly, I mean, it could be interesting for one of the tasks. For example, we use the intra-extra dimensional set shifting task that does actually have computational modeling parameters that could be conducted, which we haven't here. But it could be interesting to see, as you say, whether a more sophisticated model could pick up these differences.
Because it gives you the handle of like more sensitive.
It is, exactly. They are more sensitive. They're a lot of work goes into designing the models and how they'd be specific. That's not to say that the general statistics that we use are inferior, but they do take a little bit more theoretical thinking around how you design your computational models. So certainly that could be something that could be investigated in future.
Right, because we have to interpret like the null result part with cautious, right? It doesn't mean that it doesn't affect the co-cognition after all, because from the experience of a lot of people who like actually prescribe this to in this case patients, some would say that they have like working memory problem or attentional problem here.
Yes,
definitely. I mean, that's like casual. Go ahead, sorry.
Group, which ultimately we need to understand how these drugs are working in those patient groups, but you then have the slight confound of the disease process in and of itself. So it becomes a little bit more difficult to disentangle what is due to the disease process and mechanism, and what is actually being affected by the drug specifically, or the neurotransmitter specifically.
And then the last question, just to be clear, this is not the same population, right? The one with acute and the chronic cohort.
No, they're different populations. Yes.
So if you're gonna start another chronic cohort, you should sample at the same participant at different time point and see how it changed over time. It would be cool.
Yeah.
Is there anyone in the audience have a question? Yep.
Yes. May I ask a question? So, brilliant talk, Christelle. I'm Antifa. I'm a clinical neurologist from Thailand, Chulalongkorn, and I think the analytical model is really interesting. And I just wondered, in this healthy control group, did we have any kind of mood measurement after we administered the escitalopram, and if they correlated with blunting of the reinforcement learning? And the second question, sorry.
Oh, sorry, carry on.
And the second question is that I wondered, what's your view on the mechanism of, clinically we see patients with MDD and then we prescribe SSRI to them, and then their mood improve as well as their cognitive function. And I wonder, what's your view on what's the mechanism underlying the improvement of cognitive function, and whether they're targeted towards more. So my intuition is that the hot cognitive function might, improve a bit more than the cold cognitive function for patients with MDD if their mood improves. If that's, I don't know your view on that. Thank you.
No, two really interesting questions. Thank you. So, so the first we had a very comprehensive battery of questionnaires as well. where we looked at depression, anxiety, irritability. We looked at things like sexual function. We actually had a very extensive battery as well, which is in the publication itself, but I thought a little bit too much detail for today's talk. And most of the measures weren't affected by the drug. They stayed fairly stable throughout the 4 weeks that we tested participants. But interestingly, the sexual function questionnaire did show that those on the escitalopram group had some more differences or some deficits. So obviously, this is also something that patients report as part of this emotional blunting, is that a lot of them sort of report differences in sexual drive. And it might be, I mean, we were thinking about it in terms of that if you, because it wasn't the actual, at least in our study, it wasn't the actual drive, it was the enjoyment from sexual activity that was different. And if you see it as that, it could almost be like it's a deficit in the consummation of reward, you know, so it's actually the reward processing that is meaning that they're not enjoying sexual activity to the same extent. I mean, this isn't, as I say, this is very speculative, but it could potentially be what is actually happening when they're having these other sort of more mood disruptions. Right. And to your second question, yes, I think definitely there is a greater improvement on the hot cognition, specifically because I think they tackle these emotional biases. But again, this is largely because a lot of the deficits that we see in depressive patients is in hot cognition rather than cold cognition. But I think as I mentioned, some of the neuroplasticity effects that serotonin have, I think this could play into the cold cognitive measures. So it might not be that it's directly having effect on cold cognition, but it's having an overall effect of enhanced neuroplasticity. And this then sort of allows for the better cold cognitive measures as well. But we definitely think they're working more on these cold mechanisms. And Catherine Harmer's done a significant amount of work on the sort of cognitive mechanisms of how the antidepressants might work in terms of improving these negative biases.
All right, thank you so much. Very insightful, and I hope to see your future work in patients with MDD. That would be really interesting.
Thank you. Yeah.
There is another question which has come in chat, and it's, if the population needs a high level of hot cognition, for example, artists or comedians, would SSRIs have an effect on their performance, do you think?
I mean, that's quite an interesting question. I wouldn't be able to actually specifically answer that, not knowing the research on that specifically. But I mean, again, sort of speculating it, I would imagine that if you had a higher demand for hot cognition, then yes, perhaps if the serotonin mechanisms do in fact dampen down these mechanisms, then yes, you would notice it more than someone who's particularly analytical and doesn't really need to rely on the hot cognitive measures.
Yeah. Okay. I have one question for you. I think your analysis methods were quite powerful, I think. So there's a matching control group and things like that. Yeah, I may have seen this, but how are the effect sizes? Some of these were statistically significant, but are they just about small effects, or are they clinically relevant?
So this is the interesting thing, I think, which is why we sort of mentioned the hierarchical Bayesian modeling. So the traditional statistics, which are also obviously susceptible to multiple comparisons corrections and things like that, they weren't statistically significant and didn't particularly suggest any big differences. But the reinforcement learning paradigms, they're both using these slightly more difficult modeling or more computationally necessary modeling, and it sort of suggests they don't need the same correction for multiple comparisons, and they have a different power, so to say, than typical statistical tests. So we do think that these are genuine effects, and actually shows the specificity of the effect as well within these reinforcement learning paradigms.
And are they big enough to be sort of clinically relevant?
I mean, obviously the sample size is moderate, you know, it's not huge, and then also it isn't in the clinical sample. So although I think yes, I'd like to say that the effect sizes are moderate to large, I wouldn't be able to speculate on the fact that they'd actually be clinically relevant purely because this isn't even a clinical group. So
so that's a good point. Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions for Christelle? No. Yeah. Well, I think possibly you've intimidated people with your knowledge. Unless Kaipat has any other question. Kaipat often has questions.
Excuse me.
Oh, no, hello.
That's another one. Yeah.
I have some of two questions. My first question is about in this session we talk about SSRI on cognitive function. So in Thailand we don't use escitalopram for the very first line. So I want to ask you about another SSRI effect on cognitive function. Like we use the first line for sertraline, paroxetine, or another like citalopram, paroxetine. Do we have a paper? Do we have any paper that talk about this drug? And my second question, for MDD, we have another guideline for another drug or type of drug that we use in MDD, like SNRI, TCA. Do it have do they have the same effect like SSRI? Thank you.
Thank you. No, again, like I say, we can only speculate specifically about what escitalopram might be having these effects. But as I mentioned to Kaipat earlier, I think this may be a general mechanism in SSRIs. So any of the drugs that would be affecting serotonin specifically. I don't think this would be the same for another branch of antidepressants like the SSNRIs. And sorry, could you just repeat your second question?
Oh, I just think that you answer my second
okay,
question.
both in one. Sorry.
But for my first question, there is a lot of SSRI drug, like sertraline that we use for the first line in my country, and fluoxetine, citalopram, or paroxetine. Do it have the effect like the citalopram?
So some of the studies I mentioned, both those in the experimental animals. So I think Barry used citalopram. Chamberlain et al., which is a Science publication in 2007, he also used citalopram. So there are some that have used citalopram rather than escitalopram. I have not seen similar papers of fluoxetine or sertraline, at least not in the sort of same context of cognition in the same way. I'm not sure why they mostly look at citalopram. I mean, as I say, I know we specifically chose escitalopram as it's one of the best tolerated, and sort of has suggested to have some of the lower side effects, which obviously when we're prescribing or sort of asking healthy volunteers to take a drug is really important to make sure that we're not sort of adding any additional burden.
Okay, you answered my question really well. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have time for just one more question, I think, and there's a question in chat. So I'll read it out for the rest of the audience, but it's, what do you think are the long-term implications of emotional blunting caused by antidepressants? And how can these be mitigated to ensure the patients receive the maximum benefit from their treatment?
So I think that's a really important question. And I mean, it's of course, it's difficult because there is kind of a cost benefit with any medication. We know, you know, some medications come with side effects. If this emotional blunting is potentially one of the side effects, it's of course weighing whether that side effect is worth the benefit of taking the drug and how the main effects that you get. That being said, the way that I like to see it is that I think it's really important that if someone is, you know, making strides in their treatment and they're actually starting to get better, that we perhaps need to start thinking about whether we either taper down the medication or whether we start looking at psychological therapies and things that might not have the same side effects. Of course, this is always a really, you know, complex issue between a drug prescriber and their patient, and I think it will be on a very individual level. But I think it does need to be understood that perhaps those discussions need to be a little bit more involved and sort of understanding that you know, there really is this cost benefit, and at what point do we decide that it's better to start titrating people off of drugs.
Okay, well, I think that's probably a good point to finish, because we're just about coming up to our hour. So yeah, thank you very much for your presentation today, Christelle. It's very interesting. It's very relevant to us in terms of what we're trying to do here with clinical cognitive neuroscience. And obviously it was very relevant to the several members of the audience here, you know, who are thinking about patients and how they get treated with SSRIs. So thank you very much for coming. I'll do a little round of applause. And I'll finish that meeting now. So thanks everybody for coming. And we do have some more meetings coming up this semester. I've put them in chat if you're interested. We have one on the 13th of April about people with vestibular damage and how this may affect cognition. We have a special speaker on May the 3rd as well about electroconvulsive therapy. And this is an expert from Ireland, Professor Declan McLaughlin is going to present to us. So we have some very interesting speakers coming up as well. Okay, so I'll close the meeting there, and thank you again, Christelle.
Thank you very much, Graham. Thank you
Thank you
all.
so much. Wonderful talk. Thank you.